Well, let's officially kick our first virtual lunch off. We're really excited about the opportunity to host this lunch today. And we thank you for joining what we're calling the Understanding Unconscious Bias webinar, sponsored by the Diversity Movement. I'm Kurt Merriweather. I head up partnerships and product initiatives with the Diversity Movement. The guest we have on today is Manpreet Dhillon. Manpreet is the founder and CEO for Veza Global. She served as the United Nations Women's Consultant for developing a mentorship program. She's an entrepreneur in residence for the Women's Enterprise Center of British Columbia, and the strategic advisor for Moving the Needle and mentor for Founders Fund. So she's got a lot of skills, and we're really fortunate to have her with us today. Manpreet, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm glad to be here. I'm so excited about the topic and just being here to have the discussion.
Yeah, we are as well. And so before we dive in, I want to give you who are on the call with us today our virtual lunch. First, go grab something great to eat, something that's tasty. And while we dive in, there are a couple of housekeeping items I want to take you through. So this is going to be an interview style conversation. We want to answer questions that come up during the topic as we discuss it. Everybody's going to be muted. However, we want to make sure that you're going to be able to participate, so feel free to use the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer as many questions live as we can. We'll address those questions as they come up. Feel free to ask them as they come up during the conversation, and we'll have time at the end specifically dedicated to answering those questions. I want to make sure that you're aware of the chat feature as well as the Q&A, and so we'll see how people are thinking about things that we're talking about in real time as we use the chat as we go through the session. And so we want to make sure that you don't lose track of a thought, and we'll get to your questions in a timely manner and manage them and answer them in a thorough way. This is an extremely important thing. We want to make sure that this is an interactive discussion, and we want to make sure that your input is heard. So we know that this is central to having a great discussion. If you're talking about what we're going to talk about in your social channels of choice, feel free to use the hashtag the Diversity Movement, all one word, and tag us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. And thanks again for joining us. Enjoy your lunch. And I hope that this hour gives you an opportunity to consider some concepts and perspectives to explore as you're on your diversity and inclusion journey. The most important thing as we dive into this topic is that we want to make sure that we're thoughtful about some of the things that we're going to discuss. And a lot of what we're going to discuss sometimes can be uncomfortable, and talking about a lot of topics related to diversity and inclusion can sometimes feel uncomfortable. So we're going to ask you to, if we could put our figurative hand on your back to challenge you a little bit to ask some questions that you may not feel comfortable asking sometimes or thinking about. If you want to ask a question, you can always do that anonymously. So we want to make sure that we're protecting everyone as they're dialoguing in this particular topic. So we want to make sure that the dialogue is compassionate as well. And so we want to make sure we're not doing this in a way that's going to be going to create discomfort in a negative way because of how we talk about the dialogue. So if we're not uncomfortable comfortable being uncomfortable, then we're not doing this right. So with that, we'll dive into the conversation. So Manpreet, let's talk about unconscious bias and define the terminology itself, or to define the term itself. What is it?
Yeah.
Who has it? How's it start?
Yeah. So unconscious bias, I mean, one of the best quotes I heard, and I always forget the person who to attribute it to, but if you have a brain, you have bias. And because we all have programming, we have belief systems that we were ingrained with, but we were born with. And then through our experiences in life with our families and friends, we start to develop our thoughts and patterns. So unconscious bias is really the behavior and thoughts and patterns that we're not aware of, and the behaviors that we're not fully aware of, or where they're coming from, or what they pertain to. That's not the formal definition, but we'll sum it up. It's one of those things that we get programmed as we're growing up from media. We get programmed from our families. our friends. Like there's so many ways that we have these conscious things that we might just have an affinity to, or conscious things that we are just more prone to thinking about a certain person, a race, gender, or whatever that might be, based on what we have experienced or what we were taught to experience. And so it's not a bad thing. I mean, we all have unconscious bias, but the best thing about it is the fact that as soon as you bring awareness to it, we can start to shift, you know, and some, especially as Kurt was saying, when we can become uncomfortable with ourselves enough that we can allow ourselves to grow and stretch and think about what else is possible. That's when we can address any unconscious biases we have and how they show up in our own world.
Right. So everybody has it.
Yeah, everyone has it.
There's no way to avoid it. A lot of people will talk about how do we avoid this thing that we all talk about, but the reality is there's no way to do that. And so why can't we avoid unconscious bias? What are some of the things that stop us from?
Well, the thing is, like, if we grew up, we've grown up a certain way. Like, I'm 41. I've been taught certain things for my entire lifetime. And all of a sudden now I'm aware that some of the things that I might have been taught through my family or through some of the conversations with friends might not be something what I truly believe in. But it's something that is so ingrained in me that I can become aware of it, but it doesn't mean it's not going to come up again. And so it's something that if you've spent your entire life thinking a certain way, but now that we all of a sudden we have this awakening and this awareness of, oh, there's might be a different way of thinking about this, it takes time to even change that. But the thing is, you know, we were doing a webinar last week and we were talking about this. How often, even as like diversity inclusion professionals, we're like, oh, we should be more conscious about this. We should think about our bias that exists because we know about this topic, but it's still going to show up. But the best quote, again, another quote that we had heard was, it's not about what you think, it's about the action you take after that thought. So it's like, what are you going to do with the thought that comes up? So, you know, a bias might show up, but it's like, what action will I take that's in the highest good for everyone involved? And what will allow me to practice conscious bias if that's needed? And so it's really about the action you're going to take afterwards.
Right. So as we think about, you know, the fact that we've all grown up in different families, we've had different sets of experiences, and all of us have these experiences that we bring to the places that we operate. And so the workplace is the main reason that we're all here today talking about unconscious bias and how that comes up in the workplace. And so when we think about that, can you talk a little bit about how we show up as a result of the biases that we have at work, and what some of the impacts of those biases are?
Oh, yeah. So if we're, for example, like we're taking thinking about hiring, you know, you might see a certain name on the resume and right away you might think about what country are they from, what their behavior might be like, will they be a culture fit, will they, instead of a culture ad, what is their, you know, education going to be like, how are they going to show up in the team based on past experiences. So I can just give an example. So being my background, my parents are Indian. I was born and raised in Canada. So I went to work in another country. I'm not going to say it because you can go on my profile, you'll figure out where this is. So I'm not going to say the country or anything, but I went to go work in a different country. And it was an international NGO. So I show up, people right away, they looked at me and they assumed that I was Indian. So they started to speak to me slower. They were using different words. And as I started to speak, they're like, oh, wait a second, you don't sound like you're from India. I'm like, well, no, I'm Canadian. And right away, their tone changed. And they actually said to me, they're like, oh, I can be friends with you because you're not Indian. And I was like, oh, well, because that was their bias showing up, because they had this bias that they just could not be friends with people from India. So even in the workplace, they actually didn't talk to any of the Indians in the workplace. And based on the fact that they just on their entire programming was, I don't have anything that I can relate to them about. So that it shows up in like, and so I started talking to them about this. I'm like, have you ever hired an Indian person? They're like, no, because I didn't think they'd be a culture fit. And nothing against this person. It was really purely like based on their experience and whatever else they grew up with. So they never hired an Indian person. So every time they would see a resume with an Indian person's name on it, it would disregard it right away, regardless of anything that came about. And even if they were in a meeting, they actually admitted that they would talk over the person because they thought that their English wasn't going to be that great. So they would constantly mansplain them, even though whoever it was. And because they just felt like their English wasn't going to be that great. And that's actually how it shows up in the workplace. And then they also, when it came to their colleagues were Indian, they wouldn't actually work on projects with them. Again, just thinking, oh, we won't be able to relate, so I can't work on projects. So they actually avoided or assigned other team members. So it's actually impacting their entire life in such a big way. And this is a great example of how it shows up in the workplace, and where one belief actually was impacting everything else. And as soon as they were able to step away from that belief and think, oh, there's other possibilities here, they actually came back to me 6 months later and they're like, I've had one of my newest best friends is Indian, and we have like so much fun and we do all these things. And even we worked on this project together and all these things happened. But it's a great example of how this unconscious bias was playing out in someone's life and how it was showing up. Well, it was actually, they weren't aware fully of the fact that they were doing this about as Indian. So it was conscious afterwards. Originally, they didn't realize that their behavior was because they felt like it was just because it was Indian. So once they had become aware of it, obviously, yes, it becomes conscious as well.
Right. And so can you talk a little bit about that's a really good example of the impact of bias and how it doesn't just impact you as an individual or your team, but it can actually impact the entire company or the organization.
Absolutely, yeah.
Based on bringing in the right kind of talent and the right kinds of folks to fill roles. But can you talk a little bit about some of the other costs? So if you were to quantify some of the costs of unconscious bias, what are some of the things that you would, as you work with people, you talk to them about in terms of the quantifiable cost of that?
Well, we see that it comes across the pay equities for, we talk about gender pay equity. It shows up there all the time. We see that people will, even as when people are being put up for promotions, like there are certain biases that will show up and like who is going to be put up for the promotion in terms of where the affinity is to what type of individuals they want to kind of move forward as well. It will show up in getting customer. So even when we're working on groups, working on projects, there might be only certain people at the table and not thinking about what other perspectives need to be at the table. And that's actually another way that unconscious bias might show up. And we actually see that we're eliminating a whole different perspective based on the fact that we will position certain people on different project teams or really allow different people at the decision-making tables as well. And it also will show up in, so we lose customers through having unconscious bias. We will lose pay equity, as we mentioned. The culture will be very different because it will show up, like it does show up in a matter of how people will relate to one another. There was this one organization we were working with where the CEO was not aware that they had, the way that they treat females was very different than the way that they treat males. Just, it was a natural thing for them. And the culture ended up being the entire senior leadership team was male because they were the only ones who can actually handle the bias, the unconscious bias that the CEO had towards females. And as they started being unraveled on why people were being hired and what type of people were being hired, there was a lot of groupthink that was happening at the decision-making table because everyone had similar backgrounds, similar pathways that they got there, different ethnicities and different race, but it was a very similar path. So that kind of showed up in how the organization was being run as well.
Right. So one of the things that we often see is depending on the field that we're operating in. So STEM fields, for example, whether it's science or other things, as you've been working with clients in those areas, what are some of the things that you see in terms of hiring? You mentioned a little bit about that, but talk a little bit about in technology in particular, or healthcare, some of the things that you see in terms of hiring decisions based on unconscious biases.
Well, we have, there's a couple of companies we're working with that they would hire women that were of childbearing ages. This was not in Canada, US, it was in some other countries, but because they felt that if it hired women with childbearing ages, that they would hire them and they would leave, and then they'd have to go through the hiring process again. So that was one of the things that originally, originally it was a conscious decision, and then they started noticing as they were doing interviewing, they automatically were just putting them out of the pile without, even though they'd be the most qualified. And it was like, it was a really interesting mix of like unconscious and conscious. With the hiring also, as I mentioned, like we have, you know, when we look at blind resumes, that's one of the reasons they were introduced, because people would look at the names and look at the gender on resumes to see who they're going to shortlist. We also see it with in interview questions, men and women, again, unconsciously will get asked different questions, and that actually eliminates the pathways of how people can get recruited for certain positions as well. And then we also see it in the way that when we're looking at the culture fit, like when they'll see the appearance of someone and they think that, oh, they're going to fit in or not. When they'll make that, you know, appearances, a lot of people make decisions within the first 3 seconds, which is a very unconscious decision people make about someone without getting to know them. And that actually happens a lot in interviews that we see is how in hiring. And then also, and it shows up in like how even recruiters will promote the positions and the job descriptions. We were working with a client, and they were in a gaming industry, and they only would promote, all the language for the job description was very masculine, and they didn't realize that that's what they were doing as they were positioning it, because in their mind, the ideal person they were going to hire was male. So they were writing all the job descriptions, everywhere they were posting was only to get male candidates. And this wasn't something that, and they actually kept saying, they're like, oh, we want more women candidates. But everything in their mind was positioned to that without them even realizing that that's actually what they were positioning everything towards. So there's like, it goes along the entire pipeline in so many ways. And then it also happens in the performance management, where we've had it with healthcare, where certain people are like, well, they were hiring nurses, and they would actually mostly end up, they're like, oh, the female nurses are more empathetic or whatever. They had these like, a lot of these things are after we dove in deeper and we were coaching them, that they started to realize and why they were doing these hires. They were hiring a lot more women nurses because they felt like that's the way the profession is. So it goes up both ways, but this is, a lot of these examples are like after we've spent a lot of time diving into why they're making the choices that they're making. And this is where the unconscious becomes the conscious as well.
Right. So this is certainly a multi-layered discussion, because it's this interaction of conscious and unconscious biases. And so there's some commentary coming from some of the folks who are on the part of the discussion around technology, and that's something I want to come back to. So one person I should introduce to the group is Jackie Ferguson, who's our head of multicultural programming. She's going to manage our Q&A as we get to that. And so let's, Jackie, make sure we don't lose sight of that particular piece, is that technology does have a powerful role to play as we think about managing some of the biases that we have. One of the things that we also see is, in addition to hiring, is retention, or challenges with retention because of bias. And so could you talk a little bit about that piece of this? So there's getting people into the company, and everybody, well, shouldn't say everybody, lots of folks think that once we hire the right people, then everything should take care of itself from there. But what are some of the challenges that you start to see on the retention side from an unconscious bias point of view?
Well, the biggest thing is, I was doing an example of, like, we were doing an audit with a company about their practices. And one of the things that we noticed, that even as we're reviewing their policies and reviewing all their onboarding and any of the employee handbooks, they were written with the lens that individuals would have a certain understanding of the way the culture, this is a Canadian company, of how Canadian culture operates. So when you hire newcomers, or if you hire people from diverse backgrounds or other underrepresented groups, the terminology sometimes isn't as apparent to them if they haven't worked in a Canadian workplace before. And so right away, with that, with the lens that we kind of set up all the documents and set up everything and all the benefits as well, we eliminate some individuals to feel like they're accepted or part of the organization. based on the fact that they don't have that understanding that that others, we just assume that all of us would have. So a lot of the examples of when we're looking at thinking about retention strategy is thinking about what do individuals really need to understand in order to feel fully accepted and they belong. So what is the terminology they might need to know? What is the additional information? And for, like, again, with retention, if you're looking at harassment strategies, if you have people coming from different cultures, what gender dynamics look in different cultures is, and how they play out in the workplace is very different. So in order to create a baseline of what gender harassment, might be within an organization, it's actually defining on what's acceptable, what's not, based on the fact that we don't know what background individuals are coming with. And so having common language in everything that we're doing in terms of like retentions, in terms of like company culture, is so important in order to eliminate any of those, like how these cultural influences and biases will show up in the workplace as well.
Right.
Then it also comes in with like performance management, on what conversations are you having with your team, and how are you having those conversations. It's we were talking to one company, and they started to notice that every time they would talk to the men, they wouldn't ask them about their families. Where when they would talk to the women, they would ask them about their families, how their kids, and what's happening at home. And all of a sudden, you're dividing the gender right away, almost kind of assuming that the men didn't care about their families or they're not, balancing their family life. And it really changed the dynamic on who was, again, putting forward for performance, for promotions. So it's also like, again, watching out the language that we're using, and also in how we're approaching performance management and everything else that might happen. So
Right.
those are a couple of the key things that we kind of look at retention.
Okay. That's really helpful. And so that's a good segue. So one of the things I'm going to do next is I'm going to show the crowd here some examples of bias.
Yes.
And so I'm going to share my screen so we have a common vocabulary around some of the types of unconscious bias that are common. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Apologies for here. So here are a few types of bias that we experience. So the first that we often don't think about is affinity bias. So this is a preference for people who are similar to ourselves. And this isn't just about race, gender, or sexual identity. It could be we're from the same hometown. We have a shared experience. So that's one type of a bias. Attribution bias is that we look at ourselves and believe that our success is built on our skills, and the successes of other people are built on chance and luck. But when they don't succeed, it's their fault. So that's another kind of attribution bias we see. Beauty bias is pretty straightforward. We judge people based on how they look to us. Confirmation bias, this is a bias where we seek out information to confirm our own existing point of view as opposed to finding the right answer. Conformity bias is often thought of as groupthink, so we conform to how other people think about things. Contrast effect will compare two people and talk about their attributes based on what we think is different about them, even though there may be other differences when we're comparing them. So it depends on the dimensions that we compare. There's gender bias, which is pretty straightforward. There's halo and Hohen's effect, which is an interesting bias where we may gloss over negative characteristics of somebody if we believe that they're a good person, and vice versa. And those are a good handful of the biases that we see. And so to put you on the spot for a second, Manpreet, what's your hidden unconscious bias secret that you want to reveal? What are some of the things, what's your Achilles heel if you had to pick one based on the ones that
Mine's actually halo. I get it. It's actually funny because I always find the good in someone and I forget, everything else that might be happening. But it's, it's actually detrimental sometimes because I will stay engaged with certain relationships much longer than I should based on the fact that like, but they did this one, they have this
Hmm.
one great quality and I'll forget everything else that they've done because
Right.
I'm like, no, it's good to, based on good belief.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it's been very detrimental to me actually in some situations. Others has been great. Like, and again, with any bias, it has its strengths and weaknesses, but
Right.
there's a lot of examples where I stayed in situations longer than I should have because of
Right.
halo. Yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And I think if I was to confess for a minute before the group, uh, confirmation bias is probably one of the things that I struggle with the most, uh, where I have a belief about something and I'll use evidence to support my my belief, as opposed to trying to find out all the information or listen to different points of view so that I can find the truth. And so if I could ask folks in the chat to reveal what some of the biases that you struggle with, if you would be so bold as to talk about that.
Confirmation is my second one, so it's a toss up between confirmation and halo.
Exactly right. So anybody confessing out there about what some of your biases are?
It's also, as we're waiting for people to pipe in, it's also interesting because I run a women's leadership company, but I have
Mm-hmm.
Affinity. Most of my advisors are male, and I didn't realize that's what I kept attracting because I was ingrained with certain things about how men provide are better at business or whatever that might be. And so I have to work hard to find women advisors because I know that my bias will pop up, even though I
Right.
run a women's leadership company.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the participants is picking folks that have the same personality types. So that's something that's pretty common. So sometimes it's difficult to work with people who aren't the same as you because they think differently, and that interaction tends to be uh, frustrating because you have to explain something to somebody in a way that you don't want to, and so that creates challenges, especially as we're trying to build teams. So I see affinity bias here as a pretty common one. Um, and so it's the question is how do you overcome some of those things. uh, Beauty bias is there. Midwest bias, I have a Midwest bias too. I'm originally from Ohio, and I went to the Ohio State University. So I definitely have an affinity for folks from the Midwest. But those are the things that create similarity. When we find areas of similarity, that's what helps us working in teams. And so I think this is a good segue to talk about how to manage these things. So when you're aware of these different kind of biases, what are some of the strategies that you would recommend to manage those things, whether it's affinity bias or beauty bias, people who look a certain way and you think something about them, all those different kinds of things the group has mentioned so far.
I think it really goes back to just being curious and being like, how can I be more curious about this person? Or how can I be more curious about the situation and see something different about it? And the curiosity is when we can go in a place of curiosity and question, we're actually able to see other perspectives. So if you live in the question of, so knowing that I have a tendency to have male advisors, when I'm meeting someone, I'm like, how can I learn from this person? And instead of thinking about what their gender is or whatever else, and that actually helps me to shift into what else is possible. So that's actually how I overcome my bias all the time. So when I meet someone, if I know that I'm doing I can see the halo bias coming up a little bit. I'm like, what else do I need to know about this person that will allow me to see their truth? And just living in the question, again, it's about the action you take after the thought. And so that actually helps to really overcome the bias. And it's not being hard. Like, I mean, we see it in the chat too, but this is something that, this is a part of who we used to be. And as we're uncovering it, we're just trying to figure out what else is possible within ourselves as well. And that's how we're trying to shift it. And so we're actually just uncovering new parts of ourselves and a new way of being and rewiring our brain. And when we can rewire ourselves, it's really about, it's like, it is about the curiosity of itself as well. And, you know, and it's like just being like, okay, and that's where when we can live in that curiosity, we actually opens up a whole new world and diversity of thought that's available to us as well. So that's my always approach to dealing with biases as they show up.
That's a really powerful way to think about that. And so being able to be uncomfortable to confront your biases and get advice from somebody that you typically wouldn't normally seek out, but a lot of times there's so much power that comes from that that it causes us to do that more and more. The flip side of that, though, sometimes is things that stop us from doing that. And you mentioned this in your example earlier on, which I would term the comment that someone who made to you that said, I didn't know you could speak English as well as you do. So that would be an example, a prime example of a microaggression. So could you talk a little bit about what microaggressions are and why while there's something that we could kind of roll off our backs, why is that such a big issue for us as we're thinking about the accumulation of microaggressions over time, since they seem so small?
Yeah, well, I always see microaggressions as those little knives that are kind of picking at our energy and kind of making us leak our energy from someone else. And I mean, that's not the scientific definition, but microaggressions are those little comments that they believe about a certain, they've generalized about certain individuals, and they assume the person's going to act in that way. And they are using them as a kind of a demeaning comment in some ways. And so microaggressions, if we keep letting them go, microaggressions are a way to meant to like kind of suppress us in some way. And when we let them roll off our backs, it's not about us always having to fight someone else's perspective. It's about helping them shift their perspective in one that's going to make it a safe space for everyone. Because microaggressions don't make it safe for anyone to be there. Because then it's like you have this almost kind of power dynamic that shows up. You have a power dynamic that shows up. It was interesting. I before even learning about microaggressions, I was watching the show Blackish, and it was actually because they do such great. I love that show, but they do such great representation of a lot of these topics and how they show up. And so I always refer back to that show. But there was an episode on microaggressions, and you're just seeing how the dynamics was. And the comment was made, "Oh, you're a doctor, but that's so great that you how did you get to that great school? And how did you get to go to that good school?" And she's like, "Because I'm smart enough." Like, I don't understand why the comment is, but there was almost an assumption that she wasn't going to have gone to a good school, and it was questioning her ability and questioning her profession and questioning how she shows up at work. But it was based on this person's and how they made those comments, and you could see her body language change about herself, but it made her less believe in herself, just a little bit less. And then you can see if that happens enough times, how that can actually push someone down so much that they might not show up in the same power that they would have otherwise. So it's actually that's why we can't really let them roll off our back all the time. I mean, it's great to have to have the thick skin, you pick your fights and all those kind of things, but it's also that no one deserves to be treated that way. Everyone where they are, they deserve to be there. And how do we treat people and allow that space and honor people for where they are at as well?
So I want folks who are viewing to spend some time thinking about a microaggression, if you could, and put some examples of microaggressions that you've experienced in the chat, and we can talk about a few of them as they come in. I can I can think of one, and when we did some work when we did our course on diversity and inclusion to add microaggressions to some of the content around unconscious bias. And the one that I used was when I moved to Maryland and moved into a neighborhood that was fairly diverse. And so we had some neighbors that had completely different backgrounds than us. And I was out front. I was really excited about being in the neighborhood. We had just moved in and struck up a conversation with a neighbor. And he was telling me, oh, this is such a great neighborhood, and this is an example of how we get together and do these different things. And so he came over and started talking to me a little bit. And as he was doing that, he talked about the former neighbor, looked me in my face and said, wow, this used to be such a great neighborhood. And so that killed my excitement about being there. And now I felt like I had to explain why I was worthy to live in the neighborhood that I lived in. And so that's an example of some of the things that, all of us in some way or another may face in different settings. And so those are some of the things that we all experience. There's some good examples in the chat. When people look at you and may say, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Based on where the information may be coming from. When people ask you,
there's so many of those.
There are lots of them in here.
Yeah.
People who, depending on your physical characteristics, might say, where are your parents from? No, I mean, like, where are they really from?
Yeah.
That's, or where are you from? Why do you talk that way? There are lots of different examples.
There's so many, there's so many popping into my mind about, oh, that's so great that you got to this level. And I was like, great. I'm like, why does that? They're like, well, we never really seen people from Indian backgrounds at this level before, or being at these things. And I'm like, that's excellent. Like, I'm glad that, I shattered that for you.
Right.
Yeah. The social media worked to millennials.
Yeah. Right.
Or it's even when you ask the female in the room to go grab the coffee. I don't know how many rooms, oh, can you just grab the coffee for everyone? Or can you go to the lunchroom and get this? It's, that happened in a few different places we were at, or the minutes as well. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The social media one is interesting because I don't think that in a multi-generational workplace, people think about that being a microaggression. It's more, I think people will try to say, well, I don't know anything about it, so you do. And so you go ahead and take care of that. And so it's interesting to hear that from a different perspective, because just because I'm a millennial doesn't mean I wanted to be that the social media expert in the room.
Yeah. The getting said that older people could figure out the Zoom internet. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then there's the cultural fit
yes.
question that comes up, or a lot of times, I'm not sure you're really a good fit for this role.
Yeah.
Making an assumption about your background or your capabilities based on some things that they assume.
Or the question where the people are like, can I have a drink with this person? And that's the person they want to have on their teams. It's like, well, that's such a huge amount of bias right there. Like, how do you know that you would not enjoy hanging out with them after work, or that having drinks is the only way to have like the best people on the team? Like, there's just so many different levels of bias that exist. And when people say that to me, they're like, well, we want to have people on our team that we could just go and have a drink with. I'm like, first of all, not everyone drinks. Second of all, like, there's, you can maybe just go and have one of the best lunches you've had with someone and they'd be the best person for the team. It doesn't mean that they're not someone that you would want to not hang out with outside of work. There's just so many different levels into that. That always kind of gets to me. So.
Right. And then there's the gender bias around, and we talked a little bit about this around getting the coffee, but also taking minutes at a meeting.
Meetings,
go ahead and take the minutes. Why don't you schedule this meeting for us?
Yeah.
The tasks that seem like they're lower level tasks often get delegated that way. So I think we could go on with this chat for
there's so many
the time we have.
Yeah.
There's so many microaggressions that occur.
Yeah, I like the age ones that keep showing up about like, oh, you're so great you did so well for being so young in your career. That's always a good one as well.
And then there's the one there's the one in reverse actually. Oh, you figured out how to get on Zoom.
Yeah.
And that might be somebody who's, later in their career.
Yeah.
And so we're all making assumptions about what people know and what they don't know. And there's a lot of multi-generational things that are in here. And
well,
so,
one of the things, like even with everything going on right now, my biggest concern is about the ageism that's going to happen. When so a lot of people are, there's been, because I'm up in Canada, but there's a lot of people losing their jobs obviously right now. And them getting back into work and getting in the market, like some of the people I know who are in later stages of their career, they can't find jobs. They couldn't find jobs before all of this happened. Now I'm worried about what's going to happen, like given, the way our world has just shifted. And because it's all based on ageism, people are just like, well, you don't really know the technology that well, or you've been in the workplace too long. And Vancouver, we have a lot of tech companies, and tech companies won't even look at them. Like it's not even an option for them. And so that actually is one of the biggest things that gets to me constantly. And it's one of the concerns I have about moving forward with, after we do start opening up again.
So there's also, the chat has been interesting because there's some confession in there. So, so let's say that I realize that I have a bias against millennials. So there's certain things that I believe, and using that as an example, what are some of the strategies that I could use? I'll just make it me so I don't put anybody else out there. So let's say I'm biased against millennials. What should I do about that now that it's come to my awareness that that's something that I need to manage?
Well, it's about every time. So whenever what's your bias about millennials? Like when does it show up for
you? It could be based on experiences that I've had in the past, where there's something that needs to be done. And I just say, you know what, never mind. I'm just going to do it myself because, millennials may not want to work hard on this particular project. And I know I have to get this done. There's a deadline. I'm not even going to bother to ask anybody who's younger on the team. I'm just going to handle it myself because the work ethic isn't where it needs to be. And they just don't have enough experience.
Yeah.
So that would be an example of that.
Okay.
That is a bias.
So the moment, like the trigger point of like, I'm just going to do it myself, because that there's all this dialogue, like you just went through the entire dialogue that happens before that you make that decision. So as soon as you decide to do something yourself, it's about asking yourself, okay, well, who else could help? Who else could do this? It might be at a different level, but who else can I feel comfortable delegating this to? And even just stopping to ask yourself that question, and your answer still might be you for a variety of reasons, but it also gives you the opportunity to actually find the best. You want to find the person who has the best strength and actually is able to do it the best way. So even asking yourself the question, who else can do this the same or better? And it just opens it up, right? Because then as soon as you ask your brain the question of who else can do it, you're just also becoming curious again. You're also allowing a new answer to show up. And so it's really it's about defining that trigger point and when all the thought process happens. But yours was so clear. It was like, as soon as you decide that you're going to do the job yourself, that's when you're like, as soon as you decide that, it's always asking yourself, who else can do this with me or for me? And that will start to overcome that bias over time. It's like the onion effect. As soon as you become aware of it, it's going to show up. Then it's going to show up less, but it will show up again. So it's every time it does, you just take the moment, pause, take a breath, be like, okay, what else is a possibility right now, and go from that direction.
Right. So that's really powerful. This idea of asking yourself questions once you become aware of something. So that I think that's something that helps to create almost a different person asking you a question once you're aware of something that happens. So that can help with combating any kind of bias, really, no matter what it is. So we talked about a few of those already. So I want to shift gears and open it to Q&A. And so we've covered a lot of ground. Ordinarily this discussion would take at least half a day, I think, or more, to uncover all the different things that we want to uncover. And so want to open it up to Q&A and use the Q&A feature. So Jackie is going to manage the questions that come in. And so as the group has questions, feel free to answer some of them, or ask your questions, and then we'll begin to answer some of them. So one thing I'll start just to get the, let's see. So Jackie, do you want to take this one?
Sure, I'll just ask the questions out loud and then open it up for the group. What do you think is the most effective, sensitive way to ask people about their culture and heritage so that you can engage and learn about them without being offensive? Great question.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one of the things that I always, the question that I actually ask people is, what makes up you? And then like, what is, because that question itself, like, I mean, kind of worded differently, but like, it really comes up as, who are they? And they can answer in however they feel comfortable. And if they decide to share their background, they will share their background. If they don't, then that's up to them. And it gives them the opportunity to share what they like. Or sometimes when I'm speaking, I'll kind of share my background first. And that's usually another way that I find if they're going to be comfortable sharing or not. Because it's about creating a safe space. So when we give the other person allowance to share whatever they want, but just by creating an opening, and the opening is usually created by sharing something about yourself first. And I find that usually helps. Because I'm one of those people, I love accents, and I love learning about people's cultures and what their backgrounds are. And because for me, I'm like, I understand how that makes up a person, regardless like of what city they came from, what city were they born into, country, everything. And there are just so many things that I become curious about a person. But it's been always also interesting of having to pull back and being like, okay, how do I ask, think about creating a connection with them through these type of questions without offending them as well. So it is a little bit of a fine line, and that's how I've been managing it lately. I've tried different things, but this is my current tools that I've been using and kind of working.
The next question is, how do you call someone out on a bias or microaggression without alienating them and having them shut down?
So I use humor a lot. I will make really awkward jokes. So one of the biggest things is if we're sitting, so when I'm working with clients and we're seeing a lot of bias comes up, and I'll be like, we actually had it in a client meeting last week where everything they were doing, we're working on a diversity inclusion project, and so it's a hub, but everything was like the way that they were addressing certain individuals. And so I started making jokes, and I'm like, this is a diversity inclusion project. How can we all show up that will create a safe space for everyone that we're representing? And all of a sudden it was really interesting because I kind of just like left open as a question to the group, but it also, the person who was making those comments, they started to realize their behavior. And since then, they actually haven't made any comments that would be showing a lot of bias or showing a little bit of aggression there. But it was really about creating the safe space. So that's how I address it. I usually bring it into like a kind of a joke, or I will talk to them afterwards. This same person had a conversation with them a couple of weeks prior where I just called them, be like, hey, I just noticed in a couple of the meetings you're making a couple of these comments. I just wondering like what's underneath that. And because as we're working on this project, it's bringing up a lot of emotions for other people. So I'm just wondering, what can I do to support you as you work on this project so that we can continue to create a safe space for everyone. And so I don't do it in front of groups, and I won't do it in a public place because I always go back to as a child, none of us like to be scolded in front of other people. So I'm like, let's not try to do that in the workplace either. Try to have a one-on-one conversation separately, or make it into a group exercise in some way.
Great. The next question is, what are some recommendations and strategies you suggest for companies to focus more on this and instill this conscious thinking throughout the organization?
Well, I mean, I know Diversity Movement has some really cool resources and tools and strategies that you're all using. We know that unconscious bias training, not once a year, I think it's better to do it a couple times and just making sure people go through that as well, just so you can start becoming aware of it. it's also, it's about the organizational culture. Like one of the things a lot of our companies that we're working with right now, what they're doing is actually putting up notices in the boardroom about, well, you can't do that on Zoom, but is one of the things that like people leading the meeting would ask, did everyone have an opinion during this meeting? Where did they speak during this meeting? Was there, how could I create a safer space for everyone to voice their opinion during the meeting? You know, what was, it was really, and that's merely balancing the introvert and extrovert. And then also, especially looking back at the hiring processes and working with HR in terms of making sure there's inclusive language. That really helps as well when you're working, and making sure the hiring managers are involved with that and they understand what that might look like. And really getting managers, a lot of times that people just want to do good and they really do want to work with other individuals, and they want to be more open. So it's really giving them, working with managers and being like, how can we better support you to be managers and to have a more inclusive team? And even just by that question, they will start thinking about how they operate within a team and what that might look like even more. And the coaching for the managers would be really helpful. So the meeting room one is one that's been used by a lot of different companies and they loved it. Like they use that as your, anytime they're leading meetings, a leader of the meeting will kind of use those questions to make sure that everyone's opinion was heard. People are speaking up and there's a diversity of thought that's happening in every meeting that they're focusing on. And that was like one of the first steps that they took.
Great. Next question is COVID-19 and social distancing increasing or decreasing bias in the workplace?
Ooh, do you want to talk about the Asian racism? It's so, I mean, I think it depends. I personally, I'm hearing a lot more cases of increasing bias in terms of racism, racism going up, and then also underrepresented groups not being hired, or there's, you know, we think about immigrants and newcomers and people with disabilities and Indigenous. Then we have, so I personally have felt like it's increasing in some way, but I think it's also that there's a lot of other factors there in terms of not just bias. It's a lot of the socioeconomic systems that we have in place and the vulnerabilities that we have with economic, political, and social systems that they're being shown, and that's increasing the bias as well in many ways.
All right, if I could jump in on that one as well, then it begins to, and other things begin to enter the workplace, because the reality is the line between work and home doesn't really exist like it used to. Mm-hmm. And so how much are you going to tap into that as an organization or as a leader to understand that everyone's roles are impacted by the ability to find a place to actually work? Yeah. Interruptions from pets, interruptions from kids, and being tolerant of those different things as they happen. And so in some ways that should make us more sensitive to what's going on in other people's lives, but if you don't have the right mindset, then it can create challenges in terms of what you think about someone based on what you see when they're trying to work from a remote point of view. And so the other thing is around mental health concerns that are starting to arise now that we've been in this environment for about 8 weeks. Being able to manage that first in a lot of ways so that people can show up as their true selves, as opposed to, I've never been through an environment like this before. I live by myself. I don't have as much interaction. Being sensitive to people who are, their work quarters are different than yours are, because you might have an office versus another person who, you know, they're in a studio, so there is no separation. Their office is their dinner table and everything is around it. And so being mindful of all those different things is important. So I think, to your point earlier, there's some cases where it could reduce bias because you see more of a person and they're able to talk more about themselves. And in other cases, it may create increased bias, especially if you are hearing things in the media about how the virus got started, and all kinds of other things. And so there's definitely been a rise in some of those incidents that we've seen. Yeah. Another question is, you know, what are the common stages of unraveling unconscious bias? you've seen with your client base? Awareness is step one, but what happens after the awareness piece?
Really, the way that I always see it is it's awareness, then they take a different action, then the bias shows up again, then they have awareness again, it takes up different action. But the timeline, so if you lived in so going back to this onion effect that happens with us, imagine that you lived with this unconscious bias for 40 years. All of a sudden you're like, oh, I have this bias that shows up. You get this awareness about it. Then you will act in that, the situation might happen, you might act in that bias for like a month. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait a second, I'm working from that bias again. Let me take a step back and think about how I can look at this differently. The next time the bias shows up, it might just been a week. Then it might be a day, then it'd be an hour, then it'd be the moment. But this is this unraveling that happens as we're retraining our brain and retraining the neurons in our brain to think and function differently. And so, yeah, so it is a bias, but it really comes back to the action. And it really comes back to, I always, bringing in what is the root of that bias. And when we can clear the root of the bias, we can deal with it a lot faster because we're actually clearing out all the cobwebs that exist with it as well. And then you start to, because then from that, then you can start to see when you're being impacted by it through other people and whatever else it might be as well. So it's really the awareness, getting down to the root of where it came from, and then taking a different action each time. So I think that's all every time I've seen that. So.
Another question from the group: are there one or two common mistakes you see happening in an interview setting that allow unconscious bias to creep into the conversations?
The questions. If we don't have standard questions, that makes a big difference. Like we have, there was a recent report where you found that men and women, like the questions that they would be asked, women would be asked more questions about relationships, less on their technical skills, but more about people or their families and their not families, but like their backgrounds, where men would be asked more technical questions about their expertise and their achievements. And for the women, those questions weren't being asked. So if you can do standard questions for all individuals, that is super helpful. And then also we see that if you're hiring people from different cultural backgrounds, the references, if you reference certain, like when you walk into an interview, we talk about one of the reasons why we talk about the weather, because that's an understanding that most people have. It's easier. When you start doing sports references, there's this video I was watching, this individual, it was a new immigrant coming to this interview. The hiring manager keeps asking them sports references, and he's just looking at him and he's trying to make up, you can try to tell he's making up answers because he had just come to Canada and he'd never watched sports before. And he hadn't started watching sports, so he didn't know which team was favorite. So he's like, well, we live in Toronto, I guess Toronto's our favorite team. And that right there doesn't create that connection that the hiring manager was looking for as someone who would be a culture fit. So really thinking about the references are more common to most individuals. It would help. Standard questions, and also having hiring matrix, because that brings everyone onto what are the key qualities you're looking for, and actually look for those qualities in all candidates rather than the ones that you have an affinity to.
Right, and there's also the role of technology here as well. So this is one of the exciting areas in terms of artificial intelligence, assuming that the algorithms are trained correctly, can eliminate. Right. So unfortunately, you can put your bias into an algorithm too, but there's the opportunity to use that, and so we're excited about that as a development area.